So this is Romans chapter 16, the scripture for the 23rd of September. I think this chapter contains many names of Paul's colleagues and co-workers, and I think it's tempting to treat this chapter sort of like the closing credits in a movie where maybe you sit there and you watch it out of respect, but you don't really take it in, or maybe some of you all will leave before the credits hit in a movie. This would be a mistake, to tune out or to just skip entirely. As we consider these names, there are several gems to uncover, particularly about how the early church was organized. Let me share a couple of them with you. First, let's consider Phoebe. Phoebe's mentioned in the very first verse. And the word used to describe her position at a nearby church, it's ambiguous. It's the Greek word diakonos, which that's where we get our word deacon from, but the Greek word literally means one who waits at tables or one who serves. It could mean any one of three things. It could mean a servant, like somebody who's not an enslaved person necessarily, but like a indentured servant. It could mean deacon, like the ordained ministry, or it could mean minister, similar to like a pastor or something. Now, we have Paul using this word all three different ways in his letters, so it's not immediately clear until we look at the context here, where Paul talks about Phoebe really kind of being a woman of means. Based on what Paul says about her, she seems to have greater authority than a simple servant would have, particularly at the church in Cenchreae. That suggests that this church likely ordained women as deacons or even as pastors. And this is important to note as we consider what the early church looked like and what our congregations could look like now. Second, I want to bring to mind Prisca and Aquila. Prisca is known as Priscilla other places in Scripture, and these were traveling companions of Paul's from back in Acts chapter 18. You may remember them. Now, Paul, by naming Prisca first, prioritizes her. This is something that is regularly done in the Greek, where the first person named in a list and sometimes the last person named in a list are going to be maybe the most important people here. But the first person definitely. And so by naming Prisca first, he implicitly prioritizes her in this relationship, suggesting maybe she has a little more authority or a little more clout in her home church than her husband Aquila does. Again, important to note this sort of gender equality in the early church. And then third and finally, the final one I'll pull out of here is Junia or Unia. And you'll find this in verse 7. And some translations will render this name Unius. And while many manuscripts do add an S at the end of it, or will add an ending that seems masculine, and so the name would be Unius, there are other Latin documents from this time, like a significant number, and none of them, 0, bear witness to a name Unius existing, like at all. This is the only witness to this name existing if, Paul is talking about Unius here. It's sort of like asking whether Jason, Jason, or Jasona, Jasona, is more likely to be a child's name now in America. There's this really neat website called Wolfram Alpha, which has nothing to do with scripture, but it's kind of neat to look at. And if you type in the word name with a colon, so Name colon, and then space, and then you type in a name, Wolfram Alpha will estimate for you how many Americans have that name. And so I did this with Jason with Jasona, and Wolfram Alpha estimated that there are 5 Jasonas in America right now. And that's maybe a bit generous, right? And Wolfram Alpha also estimated that there are 1 million Jasons in America. And so 5 versus 1 million suggests that if you've got a question as to whether somebody's name is Jason or Jasona, probably their name is Jason out of 330 million people or whatever, however many we have in America. And so that's the same sort of odds we're talking with Unia versus Unius. Unia is a fairly well-established name in Latin. And so while Unius could conceivably be the word that Paul is using here, much more likely is that he's talking about a female apostle, Unia. And the Greek here not only counts her as an apostle, but one who is of note. So that means that the early church allowed at least one woman to serve as an apostle. I've linked more info about this below. But these are really important to note, this sort of gender equality among the church leadership in the early church, particularly for our practice now. One final note about Romans 16, and that's as we enter the last 6 weeks of election season here in the U.S., there are going to be people that seek to stir up dissension and offense. Don't confuse those who operate in bad faith with those who are truly trying to understand and discuss matters as faithful Christians in good faith. If God is indeed strengthening us, as Paul suggests, then we can work to sharpen one another. Remember, Jesus is a political figure and has feelings about politics, but Jesus is not partisan. So as we pursue the obedience of faith, it is going to bleed into every area of our lives, both political and otherwise. Now I wonder, who would you credit with helping grow your faith? Kind of like how Paul commends people in Romans 16. That's all for Romans 16. Tomorrow, the 24th of September, we'll be looking at 1 Timothy chapter 1. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.